get started, first I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Wurundjeri people, and pay our respects to elders past, present, and becoming. Good morning, I'm Carol Park. I'm a research student here at the Climate and Energy College. It's my great pleasure to introduce Rachelle. She finished her PhD with us just a couple years ago, and prior to that, she did her bachelor's at the University of Montana in wildlife biology. For her PhD project, she used a whole farm system to look at climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. She's currently looking at extreme events and risk management in terms of how that affects the red meat industry and the dairy industry. So without further ado, Rachelle.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me. Good morning, everyone. So today I'm going to be discussing Australian agricultural emissions and options for mitigating those emissions. There is actually quite a lot of material to go over, so I would prefer if we waited for questions at the end. This is just a brief outline of the topics that I'll be covering today. And yes, if you're interested in having the slides, I'm happy to share those. So some background on the Australian agricultural industry, quite a significant contributor to Australia's economy, and also a major user of the land area. So agricultural production was valued at $56 billion in 2015-2016. The National Farmers Federation has got a plan to get that up to 100 billion by 2030. And the land areas are shown here, and the vast majority of that is for grazing lands. So breaking that out a bit further, you can see that grazing on natural vegetation is really the largest proportion of Australia's agricultural land. And this breakdown is important in considering what mitigation options are really going to be viable in which situations, and how much impact they can have on Australia's agricultural emissions in total. So something that is going to help reduce emissions in an irrigated crop is not going to have as widespread application as something that would be implemented in a natural grazing system. So getting into Australia's agricultural emissions, these are figures from the national inventory. The total recently over here, right on 70 megatons of CO2 equivalents for the last several years. And if you keep that figure in mind as we go through the talk, so you have an idea of the size of the mitigation options in comparison to that 70 megatons of Australian emissions. That 70 is about 15% of the total national emissions. And I also want to highlight the red portion of these bars. That's enteric fermentation. It's taking up a good 70% of Australia's national or agricultural emissions. And yeah, so that is entirely from ruminant livestock systems, red meat and dairy. I also want to spend a bit of time on land use change emissions. The yellow is forestry, but all of the other colors on there are at least somewhat influenced by agriculture. So the dark green is grazing land management, and the light green that becomes a sink towards the end of the time period is cropland management, and the sort of tan color is deforestation, and that is largely driven by grazing lands. So these are categorized in a different part of the inventory, in the national inventory, but largely driven by agriculture. some projections around what is going to happen to emissions from agriculture in the future. The Department of Environment and Energy has projected that by 2030, that 70 will increase to 78, as well as some projections for land use deforestation dropping slightly and then sort of leveling off between 30 and 40 megatons. Another estimate that included greater increases in demand of products estimated that by 2030 that would be up to 112. Now, there is this last figure here is from a global study that found increasing emissions intensity, that's what the EI stands for there, means that agricultural production is not quite as tied to emissions as it used to be. But I'll get into that a bit later. So I also want to look at emissions from agriculture using a life cycle assessment framework, which is a bit different from the national inventory. And these studies, they look at the whole system. So the fertilizer that had to go in and all the things before the farm that influence the emissions of a product. So it's how many emissions are emitted per unit product. And you can see it's quite high here. The first column is beef, ranging from 10 to under 25, and that's per kilogram live weight. So looking at over 15 kilograms of CO2 equivalents per kilogram beef. Milk is close to 1, and that is a pretty solid estimate of, oops, wrong button there. Pretty solid estimate down here, looking at quite a lot of the dairy farms across the country. Sheep meat is a little less emissions intensive than beef, primarily because it's easier to get them off to market. The wool has quite a large range of estimates there, and that's mostly due to the fact that there are differences in the methodology for how that's calculated, how the emissions of the system are allocated to wool versus sheep meat and other parts of that system. The beef industry, or the red meat industry, I should say, has estimated that their annual emissions in 2015, including land use change, was 68.6 megatons. So that's pretty much, if you're including the life cycle approach, that's saying that red meat was emitting about as much as the national inventory says all of agriculture emits. And most of that is due to enteric methane, but a fair bit of it is due to land use change. Now, quite a bit lower emissions intensity in monogastrics because you didn't have the enteric fermentation part of that. The main driver of emissions in pork is manure methane, and in chickens, it's feed production and housing. So getting on to some plant products. You notice that the axis is a lot different here. We're much lower emissions intensities than the meat products. For wheat, it's generally, in fact, all the estimates have it under 0.5 kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of wheat. However, Australia produces a lot of wheat. So if you multiply that by how much wheat we produce, it would be just under 9 megatons of emissions from wheat. Other broadacre crops are fairly similar. And in both cases, it's nitrogen fertilizer manufacture and applying that leading to nitrous oxide emissions that are really driving those emissions. So some other products here, cotton and tomatoes have much wider ranges in their emissions intensity due to differences in how they're produced. So depending on the irrigation in cotton, and in the case of the tomatoes, the high end there was a case where the tomatoes are grown in a greenhouse that's powered by fossil fuels, and that's comprising over 80% of the emissions intensity of the tomatoes. Sugarcane is pretty interesting. Has a fairly small emissions intensity, and from the farm to the mill, and then at the mill you get a reduction in energy or in CO2 equivalents due to the gas from sugar being used in renewable energy production. So here's just a sample of some different vegetables. The high-end, more emissions-intensive ones are really having more irrigation as part of their emissions. And again, nitrous oxide emissions are a major part of the production as well. And for all these, they're produced on a much smaller scale, so annually not contributing much to Australia's emissions. So now getting into some mitigation options for these, I'm going to start out with just talking about increasing efficiencies. So by producing more at the same level of emissions, you reduce that emissions intensity. You spread out the emissions over more product. And this is often appealing because increasing efficiency often increases profitability. So these options are often taken up and are already being used. In crops, this revolves pretty much entirely around increasing yield. And in livestock, there's some animal management options, really focusing on those animals that produce the most, those animals that grow fastest on the least amount of food, and feeding them high quality diets so they reach market faster. So some examples of how this plays out with emissions intensity. A study that looked at closing the yield gap in some particular locations in Western Australia and Queensland found that if you close the yield gap on those sites, you'd reduce emissions intensity by over 80%. So quite a large impact there. A smaller increase in yield of 20% that was associated with lime application reduced emissions intensity by 26%. In livestock systems, supplemental feeding in Northern Australia reduced methane emissions intensity by nearly 25%. And yeah, I want to focus on this study looking at the methane intensity of milk. So just the efficiency gains over that period between 1980 and 2010 has reduced the emission intensity of milk by 40%. And I think mentioning just reducing waste in the production system is also a way to get at increasing the efficiency of these systems. So an example of that, if you could reduce feed waste in pig systems, it would reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 10%. So there is some qualifiers to this. These options often lead to decisions in which emissions in total either stay the same or increase. So if you're increasing productivity, then maybe you can add more stock or have some other option that ends up increasing emissions in total, even though your emissions intensity is declining. So that example of the 40% reduction in methane emissions intensity of milk, that's quite an improvement. And if you think about what the emissions would be without that, it's substantial. But even with that gain, the total methane emissions from milk production only declined 1.6% over that time frame. And there's also issues around what intensification that is generally associated with these options means for other parts of the business. So if you're relying on supplemental feed, does that increase your business risk and can leave you less resilient in droughts? And it also means that grazing is more reliant on croplands. And there's just showing us increased about 2% from 2005 to 2015. But if that continues, then there would be more pressure on cropping lands for providing animal feed. And where that feed comes from influences the emissions intensity of the animal products as well. Okay, so on to an actual greenhouse gas. Enteric methane is the major contributor to Australian agricultural emissions. So it's a big one that needs to be addressed. Current options that can be implemented right away have effectiveness around 20, maybe up to 30%. There are a lot of research being done on other options that might have greater efficiency or show greater reductions, but that's still in development, and the actual amount of reduction that you would get from those is not yet known. And particularly, there's been a lot of work looking into a vaccine. But the dietary strategies are available now. There is an ERF methodology that could be used by a farmer if they wanted to get carbon credits for that. But it hasn't been implemented by any farm, and that's primarily due to the cost of these feeds that have been approved under the methodology. Some additives can get higher reductions in methane. 3-NOP in an Australian system had a reduction of 32% methane, which reduced the whole farm emissions by 14%. However, again, the limitations, I've mentioned the expense. You have to be careful in applying some of these fats, nitrates, tannins. There are several additives that you kind of find the sweet spot. It's good up to a point, but if you give them too much, it has negative implications for health. And 3-NOP is in the process of being approved in New Zealand, but isn't yet, and we don't know how much it will cost. There is case for optimism with that. There is some evidence that suggests that it's also associated with increasing weight gain, and that could give an economic incentive to use it on farm. I think the big one is that these are only applicable when the farmer can feed the cows or the sheep. So that's not a lot of the whole herd, the national herd. Yes, so it would be remiss not to mention that another way to reduce the enteric methane emissions would be to reduce the number of livestock in the national herd. The first one there is a global study that looked at the climate change benefits of a healthy diet. So this diet where you only have red meat once a week reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 58%. There's a study specific to Australia that looked at replacing a portion of the livestock with kangaroos and found that would reduce methane emissions by 16 megatons. There are meat alternatives that are quite less emissions intensive than ruminants. I think the main limitation is getting that adopted. People like their burgers. And in the case of Australia, there are specific limitations regarding where these vegetable substitutes would be grown. The vast majority of our agricultural land is for grazing that wouldn't support those crops. and in the areas that you could grow them, if it was pasture or some other land use, that would be associated with the loss of soil carbon and potentially vegetation carbon. So on to manure methane. There is a really promising option here with anaerobic digestion of manure, and that captures the methane and powers the, it provides power to the piggery or the dairy, whatever operation it's used in. The pork industry estimates that if the piggeries that are large enough to have this all implemented it, they could get pork emissions intensity to less than 1 kilogram of carbon dioxide equivalents per kilogram of pork. The limitation is really on the size of the piggery. It's best for larger piggeries. In the case of dairies, it can require system level changes, and there are particular issues that need to be addressed on a case-by-case basis. Another option for piggeries that might be too small would be to do this deep litter system, which can also have quite a major impact on manure methane emissions. And yeah, that would be a system change for a piggery that is currently operating under conventional production. This has been a fairly well adopted one, with 13.5% of Australian pork now coming from a piggery that captures its biogas. And it's also been adopted in several abattoirs, which would reduce the post-farm gate emissions of agricultural products, and at least one dairy and one egg producer. And Meat and Livestock Australia has done some work on how it could be used in feedlots. Of all the agricultural emissions reduction fund methodologies, this one has over 80% of the issued carbon credits. So quite successful. And so nitrous oxide comes from both the animal producers as well as cropping. In the case of animal production, manure is a source of nitrous oxide emission, as is urinary nitrogen. And in the case of manure, there are some amendments that have been looked at for reducing nitrogen losses there. And you can adjust the energy to protein in the diet of the animal to address some of the nitrogen losses through urine. And in New Zealand, they're using inhibitors on urine patches to reduce those losses. But I'm going to spend most of my time talking about losses from the soil that occurs in both cropping and livestock systems. And some of the options for addressing that are replacing the inorganic fertilizer with other options and precision agriculture. So looking in more detail at those, if you plant a legume before wheat, it reduces the amount of nitrogen that's needed for the wheat, and that the nitrogen fertilizer needed for the wheat, and you get a reduction. In this one study, they found a reduction of 21% in nitrous oxide emissions with that management option. There are composting and manure substitutes. In the case of manure, there is a study that found that it was fairly similar to using fertilizer. It just shifted the emissions in the case of fertilizer pre-farm, in the case of manure on-farm. But I think more work needs to be done in Australian systems on the net effects of these options. Precision agriculture is another option that's being fairly well adopted. It improves nitrogen use efficiency, which reduces input costs. And a study found that using variable rate application that reduced the need for nitrogen fertilizer by 20% and reduced nitrous oxide emissions by over 30%. So with the inhibitors, it's quite variable. So a review looked at the studies that have been done and found a range of 8 to 57% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions. And some of that is offset by inhibiting that nitrogen loss pathway meant that more was lost through ammonia volatilization, and that can in the end end up meaning that you don't end up reducing nitrous oxide losses. I also wanted to mention this nitrogen fixing bacteria. This has been trialed fairly extensively with corn in the US. It's put into the ground when they sow and helps the corn uptake nitrogen, so you get less nitrogen loss through all the different pathways, including direct nitrous oxide emissions. And they estimate if 35% of the corn farmers in the US adopted it, they could save 6 megatons of nitrous oxide emission, CO2 equivalents of nitrous oxide emission. So onto land use and land use change. There's been a large reduction in the amount of deforestation in Australia since 2000. And it's important that that continues. It's a big part of how emissions have been reduced over that period. And part of that reduction is at least helped along by the increases in efficiency. So if we can produce more on the land that's already being cultivated, then we don't need to clear more land. But there are risks to that with climate change impacts, reducing productivity and potentially increasing demand for land for biofuels. This graph here, the green part of the columns that's making up the most is deforestation due to pasture over various time periods. So it is slightly decreasing, but again, a major part of what drives deforestation. Soil carbon is another option for sequestering carbon. In cropping, it's fairly limited, 0.2 to 0.3 tons per year, and that's using methods that are fairly common in Australian agriculture. That declines with depth and with time. And it looks like the greatest potential for soil carbon is in areas where the land is degraded, particularly degraded pasture lands. There's some estimates there. If overgrazing was ceased on the 11.2% of pasture that is estimated to be overgrazed, then that would save 16.1 megatons of CO2 equivalents a year, assuming a sequestration rate of under 0.1 tons per hectare per year. There's an example of a wool farm that was purchased. It was in a degraded state, and they made some changes on the farm, and over the 33 years, that soil was able to sequester enough to offset the emissions of the wool farm. So it has cases where it's sequestering enough to offset the emissions of the farm, but they're limited cases. But also the small improvements, because of the land area we're talking about, means that it adds up quite substantially. And it's also important, particularly in dairy soils, the soil carbon is already high. So it's important to maintain those stocks as well. And soil carbon also has the benefit of increasing water holding capacity, nutrient availability, various things that will also improve productivity. However, there are several limitations of soil carbon. One is that it's finite, and what I mean by that is you make a change and it increases the soil carbon until it reaches a new equilibrium. So you get to the point where the inputs and the outputs now balance each other again, and you're not going to get any more increases beyond that. And if you decide, well, I'm not getting any more increases anymore, I'm going to stop doing this, then it will go back to what it was before because it's reversible. So changes in management, changes in weather will mean you can lose the carbon that you've gained. In cropping systems, before I mentioned that 0.2 to 0.3 tons per hectare, that's compared to conventional cropping. In a lot of the cases where they've looked at it over time, even with the improved management, soil carbon is still declining. You get increases in nitrous oxide emissions in high carbon soils. One of the major ways to consistently show increases in soil carbon is to switch from cropping to pasture, but that is associated with obviously emissions from livestock. And it depends on the situations, but higher stocking rates are less likely to be offset by soil carbon. There's a lot that goes into monitoring and measuring this, and that can be costly, and there are risks, as I mentioned, around that reversibility. And on farm, if your option to increase soil carbon is to reduce your stocking rate, then that is at least short-term going to mean reductions in profitability. And options that would really put in a lot of carbon and likely show a big increase are going to require large increased costs associated with transport and large application rates of manure or compost. You get faster sequestration in trees than in soil. So this depends on the site and the species of tree. But if you assume about 2.5 ton of carbon per year or per hectare sequestration rate, then a moderate to low stocking rate can be offset by planting 20% of the farm with trees. With higher sequestration rates, you can do it over less of the farm. And that farm I mentioned earlier with the soil carbon, they also planted trees, and that more than offset. It was even more sequestration in trees than in soil. So that farm was carbon neutral a few times over. And it doesn't necessarily have to be trees. Kikuyu is a perennial, and in one instance they planted that, and with the increase in biomass on the site, they were able to increase stocking, but also get a 80% reduction in emissions. Another way of doing this is to just switch the degraded land over to forest again. And there's an estimate if you, from Queensland, if you did that over 22.7 million hectares, that would, in using this the fastest sequestration option, that would sequester 30 megatons of CO2 equivalents. And trees also have plenty of co-benefits, including improving land quality, so dealing with issues like salinity and erosion. It can improve biodiversity, and also it provides benefits on farm as well. So it provides shade and windbreaks. The limitations are primarily around uncertainty around the financial case. So it depends on the tree species and the site, and what values you put on other aspects. So are you including the benefit the tree is providing as shade, and that those kinds of co-benefits give a wide range in what carbon price that would become economical. And similarly there to soil carbon, you have the risks associated with drought and fire. So getting into more replacing fossil fuels and using agricultural products to replace fossil fuels, I've included some examples here where cellulosic biofuels result in net negative emissions. So from planting through to combusting the fuel, you've stored carbon. The first two are from the US, but the last one is from Western Australia, looking at Meyer. I'm gonna just go ahead and, and again, this, there's a lot of things to consider when looking at biofuels. Some of the more general ones, the prices of the fuel that they're replacing, the distances that need to be traveled, but also really the land issues. What you don't want to put these in where the carbon stocks are already high. To really get those net negative values, you have to think about the whole being planted. Are they going to mean that somewhere else gets cleared because you need to grow food? Several things to keep in mind, and really needing to look at what native species can be productive on the sites that this would be best done on. I wanted to spend a bit of time on reducing emissions or replacing fossil emissions upstream. So there's a lot of interesting things going on in the fertilizer industry. There are 2 plants now in Australia that produce fertilizer renewably on a small scale, but this is definitely getting traction as ammonia becomes more not just looked at as fertilizer, but as an energy carrier in a hydrogen economy. I mentioned that nitrogen fixing bacteria in regards to nitrous oxide emissions, but it also would reduce the need for fertilizer use. And there's other research going on into options that would allow farmers to use solar power to produce small-scale ammonia at their own farm. And it's been looked at for a while, and it's quite a tricky issue, but they are researching how to get cereal crops to fix their own nitrogen. In the case of irrigated systems, it would be switching from powering the irrigation pumps from fossil fuels to renewable energy would reduce emissions intensity in a lot of those systems quite dramatically. And had some examples up here. That's the economics of that are going to be determined a lot by how often the irrigation is being used. But there is some carbon credits and various ways to get finance for that. There's also renewable energy for greenhouses. Sundrop Farm is an example of a case where they're using solar energy to power the greenhouse. And there's a plant in Western Australia that uses it's a waste energy plant, but it uses its waste energy to grow blueberries as an additional income stream. So looking at waste, there's quite a lot of potential there. I talked about anaerobic digestion already, but those are associated with reducing the need for grid energy. And there's wine grape waste at a vineyard. They were able to completely replace oils and make a large reduction in their use of LPG. And in terms of what that means in CO2 equivalents, In the case of using olive waste for energy, it's a net negative emission. And there's also the potential for using waste to replace other intensive feedstocks. So using bagasse in place of eucalypts for wood pulp or paper in paper production. So what this means, to give some context, at the beginning I gave some emissions trajectories. It was about 11 to 43% by 2030 that emissions might increase in agriculture. And just comparing that to how emissions intensity has improved over the last decade or two, in agriculture as a whole, probably about 2% a year. In red meat, including those land use change values, it's about 5% a year, but that is dependent on the deforestation part of that. So at some point, you can't stop, hopefully you stop it, and then there's no more stopping it, and you can't count on that anymore. You've got to get those gains somewhere else. Milk, about a 13% reduction in EI, or in emissions intensity, if that rate that was reported from 1980 to 2010 is continued. And I've mentioned this in wheat, the stalling wheat yields, making it hard to know exactly how hard it's going to be to meet, to be able to produce to meet the increased demand without increasing emissions, total emissions. Because as climate change starts to impact these industries, it gets harder to make these emissions intensity goals. So, and that's also been observed in milk, and as I mentioned with red meat, if it's a lot of the gains were sort of low-hanging fruit, and now we're going to be having to meet these same, just to keep emissions flat, keep these same gains in a world where climate change is impacting on yields. So to sum up, there are a lot of options that can be implemented right now that would have quite a large impact. Improving efficiency, restricting deforestation, really implementing these new technologies. And I think a focus on degraded land really comes out both in terms of soil carbon and trees and bioenergy. This is really where we have a lot of opportunity to get to net zero or even negative emissions. Long term, we really need to address enteric methane, because that's where really the vast majority of the emissions are coming from. I think it's interesting that while looking at the options that really help address these issues, it really blurs the traditional inventory lines of agriculture and land use and waste, and how you might be able to make gains by going across those boundaries. If society does decide that we're going to eat less meat, Australia will need to figure out where it can grow its protein. And I think looking forward, really figuring out what the barriers are to implementing these options that are ready to go and could have an impact right now. So I want to say thank you and plug the talk that's on next week. So do you have any questions?
Thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. I'm Gordon Hurst from Chiang Mai University. In your soil carbon mitigation,
Yep.
did you include the use of biochar in any of your models?
No, and I should note that all the information here is from literature review, so other studies that have already been done, and so not my own work. And yeah, I didn't look at biochar. I do know that it has the best case when the biomass that is used to create the biochar is already accumulated in like maybe a green waste program or something, so that you don't have to.
If it's an economically push system like they have in China, where they have a biomass problem.
Okay.
So they actually, yeah, they have a
Yep.
negative effect.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you.
I've been asked to say my name, that's easy. David Wood, former Dean of Engineering, Melbourne Uni. Most of my lifetime was spent working on research in the minerals industry, and in particular in coal. And I totally ignored any thoughts of agriculture, a typical coal person, and oil. And it blew my mind a few weeks ago when I read a paper, I think it was Minnesota University, but I can't be sure, on this sort of topic. The total amount of agriculture production of greenhouse gases, way ahead of transport fuels. Would you agree with that? That's what it said in this paper.
Globally?
Globally.
Yeah.
And I just fell over. I couldn't believe that. So I've now become very interested in the agricultural side. I'm trying to understand it, being a person who's never worked in that field. And what you're doing is terrific, and I think it has enormous implications for Australia. But what I can't see in what you've produced today, and I haven't read any papers of yours, is any comparisons with the traditional energy sources. You know, if agriculture is relatively small, we needn't bother. Well, that's not true.
Right.
It's big. And I think it would be good for the readers of any publications if you emphasize the importance of agriculture compared to other energy CO2 producers, mainly CO2. In your case, it's high intensity emissions, methane and so on. So I think that I'm looking forward to reading further papers on this that come out of Australia, and presumably you'll be one of the leaders in that. So please keep doing it, but please do the comparisons that we need with all other forms of greenhouse gas emissions, because I don't believe people in power, in governments, really understand this at all. And you need to convince them.
Okay.
That's a comment more than a question.
Hello, I'm Tom Garish. I'm from DELP, so it's Victorian Department of Energy and everything else.
Yep.
So I guess following on from the last comment, we are, the state of Victoria has a net zero goal in the legislation now for 2050. So our challenge, and I guess that's me personally and the branch I work in and the government as a whole, it's really all about how to get there. So what are the trajectories between where we are and where we're going to happen and where we're going, and how can each sector contribute?
Yep.
And we're certainly aware of the need for every part of the economy to work together. And I think this is a great example of one sector that sort of straddles or has kind of overlap into energy, into land forestry, and so forth. So I wanted to thank you firstly, but I guess another obvious question, I suppose, is some of the productivity gain suggestions that you made. If they increase productivity, then why aren't they doing them already?
Yeah, in most cases they are. The animal management one, the reason that we've seen those emission intensity decreases over the last several decades is because they are. But generally, they're sort of low-hanging fruit. So getting better at applying nitrogen, not stopping deforestation or restricting deforestation. These things have helped get there, but the next step, I think, is going to be a bit harder and require a bit more, yeah, just creativity and yeah, and also making sure to keep in mind that we're going to have to meet these goals as the climate changes and affects agriculture.
Okay, we've got one question from online for you, Rachelle. This one's from Sam Martinson. Apologies for pronunciation if that's incorrect. He's a PhD student, or he, at the Centre of Policy Studies at Victoria University. They asked, do you have any questions on the potential of holistic planned grazing? So essentially planning your grazing rotations in order to store carbon.
Yeah, I don't have actual numbers on the how much can be sequestered with that, but I have heard that it can be quite successful in improving carbon stocks in pastures. And I would expect that that would be more so in pastures that are currently degraded. So if you're restoring the land, then you would get larger improvements.
I'm going to override the moderator and give the question to a woman because we haven't had one.
Hi, thank you. My name is Miriam Rothstein. I work for Climate Friendly. We're project developers. Mainly, I wanted to just tack a comment onto Tom's question before. Why isn't there more uptake in terms of the, and how can we get people to uptake these lower, these improved methods? So
right.
A comment that I've got from the field I work in is that when we develop a carbon project, I work in the HIR space, it enables the payments from those, from the credits, enables these farmers to make a lot of the infrastructure changes that they need to make in order to facilitate destocking, and that enables them to decouple themselves from that cycle of needing to clear to feed their stock. Yeah, so there's a real economic element to it.
Yes, that's right. And I think the success of those of the ERF methodologies around manure methane really show how when you get it right, the uptake is quite good.
Yeah, removing the hurdles.
Yep.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'm Ian Blair. I'm in agriculture. My question is to how much attention have you put to such things as cross-laminated timber going into buildings, which then you don't have to prune your trees. You are able to build 10-story buildings with timber, and that is then sequestered. That needs legislation change.
Yeah.
The other area of Prof. Peter Scales' work with deep ripping and putting into duplex soils, chicken manure and biochar, increasing virtually in perpetuity the performance of your soil. So some of these things are multifactorial that will enable you to increase productivity into the future. You've mentioned nitrogen fixing bacteria, but there's also phosphate releasing bacteria that you can therefore tap in to our phosphate bank, which then reduces your carbon emissions for fertilizer. So I think those things should be considered, because they, being applied over a very wide area, can reduce your emissions. Can you make a comment, please?
Yeah. So as far as using the wood products, I didn't look into that. I know that there is some issues around the accounting of what you do with the trees that you grow when you're sequestering carbon in trees on farm. as far as the fertilizer goes, I did focus on nitrogen fertilizer in this, but yes, there is a need to look at the other different lime and various things that are applied on farm. And as far as various ways of increasing soil carbon, the more that you can add to the soil, the greater carbon uptake you'll get. But a lot of these things are restricted by just logistics and economics.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. My name's Mark Whitten. I'm from Jigsaw Farms. And one of the studies you referred to there, Natalie Doran Brown actually did on how we achieve carbon neutrality in a high input system.
Yep.
We're beef and wool producers and prime lambs. One of the issues is, and it was from the department, was basically about uptake. And my observation is the question, which is if you looked at some of your statistics about the broad range in terms of carbon intensity, well, if nothing least that you actually look at where the best practice is and try to emphasize that as a product, then you'll have higher impact, because then all of a sudden you've got economic drivers in the system. I mean, the truth of the matter is that the Northern Australian beef system, because of their terrible fecundity levels and some of their management issues, are in deep strife in terms of a comparative sense.
Yep.
So if you actually look at where you can produce efficiently and you can do tick a lot of those boxes in terms of efficiency, it's a gain. Just as an aside, and the question I think came from one of the universities online, someone there, the problem with a whole bunch of the soil and regenerative agricultural people which are out there now is there isn't science to support what they're actually promoting. And it's a feel good, fantastic. Charles Massey writes the books, etc. But it isn't. There's no science to back it up, and it's a very dangerous path we're going down at the moment, which is moving science away and evidence based from where we should be going, and that does affect the uptake when you actually have these promotions going on, and it's a battle. But having said all that, that slide you've got there, the Tallaheny one, which is John Ives' property, that's why they came and did us, because that's a low input system, and they tried to make it work in a high input system. It does work. Yep. It's just that it's a challenge to actually get everything lined up. But I really do commend you for your effort. It was fantastic. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. Are there any that are questions rather than comments?
Hi, thanks for the presentation. I'm Bruce Poon from the Animal Justice Party. With the range of mitigations that you've outlined, and our friend from DELP reminded us there are targets, in fact, legislated targets that governments have. Has there been any work by you or somebody else to look at the range of mitigations that need to be applied to meet the target profiles?
Yeah, there has been. So I think the industries themselves are looking into this a lot. I've mentioned some of the work of MLA and the Pork CRC have looked into how to really address these issues in their systems. But as far as a scientific investigation of sort of pathways to get Australian agriculture, particularly on a broad scale, not looking at a sector basis, I'm not aware of that level.
Great. Please join me in one more round of applause for a very comprehensive talk. And come join us again June 12th for Adam Bumpus's talk on energy entrepreneurial ecosystems. Thank you.